Oh boy, am I excited for this one. My name is Waffles the Asian Yen Bear, and today we're talking about how to win with the brand new leader Uda. If you guys are new to my channel, I play One Piece in Japan, and this was my absolute favorite deck in the OP-05 metagame. So much so that I put about 4,000 extra yen into it to see the film read encore twice for the promos. Now of course, I'll give you some substitutes for the promos if you can't get into the special promo tournaments, but Uda is a very fun deck. If you like combo decks with a ton of consistency, then Uda is the leader for you. It has a great matchup against most of the format, and it's pretty easy to get the hang of. If you got 2 copies of the Uda starter deck, you have almost all the cards you need to play it. The aim of the deck is to out-resource your opponent. You're going to be slowly poking at them until you get them to a spot where you can yell checkmate, burst into song, and hit them with a 9k Uda 3 times in a row. Now, let's get the unfortunate part out of the way. You will need 4 copies of the OP02 Nami. This is non-negotiable. For whatever reason, Bandai did not include any reprints of her in the starter deck, which is crazy, so she's probably pretty expensive. But Nami searches pretty much everything in your deck, and without her, you're going to have a lot more trouble. When you play her, you're usually going to want to have that extra Dawn available for her on-play search, especially against yellow and black decks. She's a prime target for Enel's Gidatsu play and Sakazuki's Houndblaze. We'll talk more about those matchups later, but having Nami early is important. So much so that I will usually mulligan if she is not in my opening hand. You're also going to want 4 copies of New Genesis. New Genesis is also a searcher, but as an event, and only grabs film cards, and you get 2 copies from the starter deck. The cool thing about it is that it restands the Dawn you use to play it, so you never have to hesitate to use it. If you ever played old school Yu-Gi-Oh, think of this as Pot of Greed. It is just extra draw power and makes it more likely that you see the cards that you want. Next, you'll need 4 copies of OP02 Brook and 4 copies of OP02 Luffy. Those come in your starter decks and are wonderful for the deck. Brook has an on-play ability that lets you play a 3 cost or lower Straw Hat or film character, and Luffy does the same thing but with 4 costs or lower. That means for 7 Dawn you can drop a Luffy, use Luffy's effect to play Brook, use Brook's effect to then play Nami, Usopp, or Uda. It is a very easy way to build up the board. Now, you're also going to want 4 copies of Dracul Mihawk from starter deck 12. However, as of recording this video, that starter deck is not out yet, so hold your horses on that one. He's another combo enabler. He's 3 costs, and if you have 2 or less characters after you play him, he lets you play a 4 cost or lower slash character from your hand rested. That means Brook and a few others. But that gives you 3 characters on your second turn. On top of that, he's also a 2k counter, so he's a fantastic addition. You won't need anything else from starter deck 12, so if you can find the Mihawks as singles for cheap, then I'd recommend grabbing those. Until he's out, we use the 2k counter Izo, just because he's the best alternative, but if you can't get those, any 2k counter is fine. There's also one more 2k counter card that you want on the deck, and that is Tony Chopper. His entire role is to be a searchable 2k counter. You will almost never play him on the board, but you want him at 4 copies. The last thing I think is absolutely necessary is 3 copies of I'm Invincible, or Watashi wa Saikyo in Japanese, because I'm Invincible is a goddamn terrible name. As you can see from the other combos, the deck excels at going wide and getting a lot of characters on the board, but Watashi wa Saikyo allows you to go big. This is usually your endgame. You want to get enough characters on the board to poke at your opponent and make them waste their blockers and counters, so then you can attach 4 or 7 Dawn to Uda and go for the kill. You want them to be unable to counter out and to have no blockers left, then you throw down 1 or 2 Watashi wa Saikyos, which makes Uda active again, and you get to hit them again and again. It is a really important card for the endgame, but it tends to clog up your hand if you run 4 copies, so that's why we're running 3. Now everything else can be changed a bit, but here's what I recommend. I like 4 copies of Zoro. He's the other card we can combo with Luffy and with Mihawk, and at 6k power he does have an easier time dealing with certain leaders, especially red and purple Luffy. I also like 4 copies of Usopp for a similar reason. He combos with Brook if you don't have Nami or Uda in hand. And I run 4 copies of the Uda blocker. She is a cheap blocker, and I usually only use her ability to restand Nami if I feel like I need Nami for longer. She also combos with Luffy and Brook. Now, I run 4 backlights. Backlight is situational depending on the matchup, but when it comes through, it really comes through. Again, we'll talk about this more later on in the matchup section, but trust me, it's worth it. As far as the promos go, I run 2 copies of Gear 5 Luffy and 2 Where the Wind Blows. If you don't have access to those, then you can substitute Luffy with either 10 cost Doflamingo or 2 5-cost Frankies. The point of running Luffy is just to have a big hitter that's searchable with counter. Frankie is weaker but has counter and searchability, while Doflamingo is more expensive but the on-play ability can be big. Where the Wind Blows is one that is really tough to replace, but I'd recommend 2 copies of Paradise Waterfalls or Spiderweb. The idea behind Where the Wind Blows is that it allows you to go all in with your blocker Luffys and Namis while keeping your opponent from attacking into them next turn. Paradise Waterfalls and Spiderweb can restand 1 character, so you can go for a similar effect, it's just a lot weaker. Now for the last 3 slots, I like to run a copy of Frankie and 2 copies of Law. Frankie is a nice card to be able to play on my 3rd turn if I have 6 Dawn. If you don't have Brook and Nami in hand, turn 3 can be a little awkward, so I do like having the additional option. He's a 1k counter too, so he always at least has some use. Law works with Mihawk and Brook and allows you to play a 3-cost film character on your next turn for 1 Dawn. It gives you a play if you're going second, but otherwise he's mainly just there to be another searchable 1k counter. You're looking to have either a searcher in your hand or a way to play 2 characters at once on your 4 Dawn turn, so Brook plus Usopp or Nami, or Mihawk plus Brook or Zoro. The worst case scenario is drawing into all your high cost characters and only being able to attach your Dawn to Uda and swing. Your deck search can help you set up for the later turns, so we aren't worried about getting late game cards in the early hand. So generally you want to go second versus most decks. It's not a huge deal, but you do set yourself up better for a turn 6 than a turn 5. On the even curve it goes like this. Turn 2 you play Law and or use New Genesis. Turn 4 you play Brook into Usopp or you play Zoro, neither are rested. You can also play Nami and get her on play ability. If you played Law, you can also use his effect to get Nami out and then use her on play effect plus a 2 Dawn swing with Uda. Turn 6 you have your leader Brook and Usopp or your leader and Zoro with 6 Dawn available. You could also have Nami out and ready to swing. You might have 1 less life, but you're in a better spot to keep up the momentum. On the odd curve it looks like this. Turn 1 you pass or use New Genesis if you have it. Turn 3 attach 3 Dawn to Uda and swing or play Mihawk into Brook and Usopp or into Zoro. Turn 4 they swing at Brook or Zoro. Turn 5 you have your leader, Mihawk, and maybe Usopp ready to attack with. Tip number 1. This is pretty obvious, but Nami's search is better than your leader. If it comes down to swinging 6k or saving that extra Dawn for Nami's ability, use it for Nami. Tip number 2. You don't have to worry about this one if you're using my deck build, but remember that the biggest bonus to playing this deck is that you should be constantly drawing more cards. That means you need to make sure your Uda has a high probability of hitting a film card. Be very careful about adding non-film cards to the deck. If you're using my deck, you have a 13% chance at worst on turn 3. That's if you've drawn all film cards and your life is also all film cards. I don't think this percentage should ever be over 20, so you want to make sure you keep the number of non-film cards to 8 max. Tip number 3. Pay attention to your opponent's hand size. Remember, red and yellow decks will typically run a lot of 2k counters. If you go for the Watashi wa Saikyo too early and they can counter out of it, then you're wide open and you will usually lose. You can be a bit patient with this deck. It spams out cards, but that doesn't mean you have to rush with them. And tip number 4. Be smart about when you play Nami. Know which decks have an early answer for her. You want her out early, but you want to maximize the value you get from her. If you play her and then she's immediately removed, then you didn't make a very good trade. You can typically bait out their answers with Usopp or blocker Uda, so do that instead. Alright, let's talk about the matchups. First, the big 3. Versus Sakazuki, you have the advantage. Sakazuki has to spend resources to remove your board and thus can't spend as much Dawn on attacks. You should be able to speed out characters faster than they can remove them, and Sakazuki is especially weak to Uda swings as they usually only run Tashigi and Suru for 2k counters. You should usually wait to play characters until you can play more than 1 at a time. Until then, you can just attach Dawn to Uda and swing on turn 4 and 6. They'll usually let you take 1 or 2 life. Never play Nami first if you have another 3 costs early on. This is a deck that has a ton of answers to 4 costs or lower, so you want to bait those out. Your blocker Luffy and 8 cost Luffy are pretty darn good in this matchup. Just make sure you're also getting in those Uda swings. So play blocker Luffy on turn 8 or 9 and 8 cost Luffy on 9 or 10. Keep at least 1 backlight in hand for the final turn. KOing their blockers is usually not that helpful early on since they can just recycle them with Rebecca. Even though you can't KO Borsalino that way, you can still rest him, which is why we want to keep the backlight. Also, be aware of when they're swinging into you when you can obviously just block it. They're trying to get you to waste counters before they remove your Luffy. Don't be afraid to just block it and incentivize them to attack with the Borsalino. If you do that and you drop a 2k counter on the Borsalino attack, then you saved resources, made them waste the Borsalino hit, and they still have to drop the resources to remove Luffy. Blocker Uda should be an instant block whenever they attack. She won't last long on the field. Against Purple Luffy, you're looking to match their aggressiveness. You want to get a few hits in early while dropping characters. That'll make it much easier to deal with their endgame. Once they're in the 1 to 2 life range, you can focus on reducing their hand size and setting up blockers to deal with their big hits. Once you've got them in the right range, you can push for game with Watashi wa Saikyo. One thing you should be careful of is their Kaido play. You're playing the blockers just to slow them down, but if you're too reliant on them, Kaido will come out and just KO Uda with his on-play effect. Versus Enel, you definitely have the advantage, but they have a tendency to trigger into Capone and stop the Watashi wa Saikyo play in its tracks. You're better off going wide and going fast here. You want to swing at life as much as possible unless you're just going to activate Enel's ability on the last swing. When not swinging at life, you want to focus on removing characters. Gidatsu is an easy target for backlight, but so is Sanji if they swing with him. The only way you lose this matchup is if they get 3 or more high-cost characters out like Big Mom, Katakuri, or Yamato. That's why you have to keep the pressure up and finish them before they can get to that point. Remember that they have a lot of 2k counters, so you want to swing with either 5k power or 7k or higher. 6k is pretty much a waste of a Dawn unless you're just trying to get Uda's search. And on that note, pay attention to their hand size and life. Remember, to beat Enel, you have to be able to get their current life plus 2 attacks to hit. So if they have a large hand size or a lot of blockers, you should continue poking and expanding your board. If you do go for the Watashi wa Saikyo play, then just do it with the intention to activate it once, not twice. That extra 3 Dawn is much more useful on Uda since they'll have to waste a lot of counters on it. A good blue Doffy player is actually quite hard to beat with Uda. They can go wider than you with blockers and will draw into a lot of 2k counters. My best advice is to poke as much as possible and to rely on your backlights to remove their Boa engine. Thankfully, a good Doffy player is quite hard to find. Iceburg is also a tricky matchup as they use a similar strategy minus leader swings. The biggest issue for us is the banish from Kaku as it denies us some important draws. The best thing we have in this matchup is our ability to swing at them with our leader, so make use of that and remember to hit them with 7k swings, as they do have Khalifa and various other 2k counters. Rob Lucci is like the Sakazuki matchup, but a little bit tougher. If you go wide, you need to do it in a big combo like Luffy into Brook into a 3 cost, anything else is just going to get KO'd. You want to prioritize searching and getting to your high cost characters. Frankie can be pretty helpful as long as they can't immediately remove them. And lastly, make sure you're saving backlight to deal with their problem characters. So how does this do in the future? Well, pretty darn well actually. She falls off a little in OP-06, but not too bad. While she's generally a top tier contender in 05, she ends up being just decent in 06. The entire game gets a bit quicker, but she can function well as a rogue deck. She gets mainly 1 card, and that's Hody Jones. He's mainly just a nice big rush character for green decks, so we can just swap either Frankie slots or the promo Luffy. Then even further on, she gets 2 new buffs in the EB set. In Japan, so far, she's been okay. She has won a couple tournaments, and that 2k Sanji has been a big difference for that. So yes, I'd say this is a pretty good deck for the foreseeable future. Now that's it for me. Sorry if my voice has been a little bit weird today. I am currently sick, so thanks for bearing with me for that. But my name is Waffles the Asian Yenber, and I'm invincible.